I signed the papers the morning my wife told me I was no longer the man she married. She didn't say it that way, of course. She never did anything directly. That was always her style. The sideways comment, the implication, the look that said everything she wouldn't put into words. But that morning, standing at the kitchen counter with her coffee going cold beside her, she slid a manila envelope across the granite and said, "I need you to look at these when you have a moment." I'd just come downstairs, 63 years old, moving slow the way you do after a bad night, my left knee complaining like it always does in November. I was still in my robe. I hadn't even had coffee yet. I looked at the envelope. I looked at her. She was already picking up her phone. I pulled the papers out. It took me a minute to understand what I was reading, because I genuinely didn't expect it. Even then, even after everything, I didn't expect it. Dissolution of marriage. Filed in Hargrove County. My name. Her name. The date. "You already filed," I said. She didn't look up. My attorney said it was better to file first. "It's just paperwork, Owen. Don't make it dramatic." Owen. That's me. Owen Darlow. 63. Retired electrician. 31 years married to a woman who had apparently retained an attorney without telling me, and filed for divorce on a Tuesday in November while I was upstairs sleeping. I stood there in my robe holding those papers, and I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Not grief. Not anger. Something quieter than both of those things. I felt like I finally understood something I'd been trying to figure out for a long time. I should back up. 6 months before that morning, I had a stroke. It was minor. That's what the doctors kept saying, a minor ischemic event. Like calling it minor made it less of a thing. I was at the hardware store. I was looking at PVC fittings, trying to remember whether I needed 3/4 inch or 1/2 inch for the bathroom project I'd been putting off all summer. And then my right hand went numb. Then my face. I sat down on the floor right there in the plumbing aisle, and a kid who couldn't have been 20 years old called 911. I spent 4 days in the hospital. My wife came the first day, stayed about 2 hours, said she had things to handle. My daughter drove up from Knoxville and stayed the whole time. My son called. My wife sent a text on day 3 that said, "Hope you're feeling better. The dog needs his heartworm medicine." I remember reading that text and not feeling hurt by it exactly. Just noted. Filed away somewhere. The doctor said I'd have some residual effects. My right hand had a tremor now. Not severe, but there. Enough that I couldn't do the finish electrical work I used to do without concentrating hard. Enough that my handwriting, which had always been careful and deliberate, now looked like something written on a moving bus. I did physical therapy 3 times a week for 2 months. My wife came to exactly 1 session. I'm not saying this to paint her as a villain. I'm saying it because it matters later. After I got home from the hospital, things were different in the way that things are different when a couple has been running on fumes for years and one of them finally stops pretending there's still gas in the tank. She started sleeping in the guest room. She said it was because I moved around too much at night. I didn't argue. I was tired in a way that goes bone deep. The kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. I threw myself into the small things. Fixed the bathroom finally. Organized the garage. Took the dog on long walks every morning, even when my knee was bad, just to have somewhere to go that felt purposeful. I started having coffee with a neighbor of mine, a retired school teacher named Prentice, who'd lost his wife 2 years before and had that particular kind of peace about him that only comes from having already survived the worst thing. Prentice didn't say much. That was one of the things I liked about him. We'd sit on his back porch with our mugs and watch the birds work the feeder, and he'd say something every 15 minutes or so that was worth more than an hour of most people's conversation. One morning he said, "You know what I've noticed about men our age? We spend 30 years building things, and then we're surprised when someone tells us the building is theirs now." I didn't say anything. I just watched a chickadee attack the feeder like it had a personal grievance. "Pay attention to what's in your name," Prentice said. "That's all I'm saying." I thought about that for a week before I did anything about it. What I found when I started paying attention was this. 8 months before my stroke, 10 months before she handed me those divorce papers, My wife had made changes to our joint life insurance policy. We'd had it since our late 30s, one of those whole-life policies that had built up a significant cash value over the decades, the kind of thing you don't think about because it's just always been there. She had removed herself as co-owner and added her sister. I didn't notice at the time because she handled most of the household paperwork. I handled the physical things, the house, the cars, the repairs. She handled the accounts, the insurance, the bills. That was just how we divided it, back when dividing things felt like partnership instead of territory. I found the change when I pulled all our financial documents together, which I hadn't done in years. I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with a cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad, and I was trying to get a clear picture of where we stood, the way you do when you suddenly realize you should have been paying closer attention. The policy document was right there in the accordion file where it always was. But something looked off. I called the insurance company on Monday morning. The woman I spoke with was patient and professional. She confirmed the change had been made. She confirmed the change had been made. She confirmed the date. She confirmed that the change had been authorized by my wife, who was listed as the managing account holder. Is there anything else you'd like to know, Mr. Darlow? I had a lot of things I wanted to know. None of them were questions the insurance company could answer. I hung up and sat with it for a while. The change had been made 8 months before my stroke, which could mean nothing. People change beneficiaries and policy structures all the time for all kinds of reasons. Maybe she'd had a conversation with her sister about it. Maybe some financial advisor had suggested it. Maybe it was entirely innocent. But I thought about that morning in the hardware store. The way my hand had gone numb. The way I'd sat down on the floor, and a 20-year-old kid had called 911, while I sat there wondering if this was how it ended. And I thought about my wife, who had filed for divorce 4 days ago and was now upstairs sleeping in the guest room. I thought about Prentice. Pay attention to what's in your name. I called my son that evening. He's 34, lives about 40 minutes away, works in logistics. He's always been more practical than emotional, which I usually find steadying and occasionally find cold. But he's the one I trust to help me think through something without letting feeling get in the way. I didn't tell him about the insurance yet. I just told him I wanted to talk to a lawyer. He said, "About the divorce?" I said, "About everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll go with you." The lawyer I found was recommended by Prentice, whose son-in-law had used him for a business dispute. His name was Aldridge, office over on the square in town, 3rd floor. The kind of place that still had actual books on actual shelves. He was about 60 himself. The kind of man who looked like he'd heard everything and was still paying attention. I laid it all out. The divorce filing. The stroke. The insurance change. The timeline. Aldridge didn't react much. He made notes. He asked a few questions. He asked whether we had other accounts, other policies, property beyond the house. We did. We had a rental property. A small house about 12 miles from here that my father had left me. We'd rented it out for years. The deed was in both our names, which had made sense at the time. I had not thought about the rental property in months. I'd been so focused on recovering, on the therapy, on the tremor in my right hand, on just getting through each day, that I had not thought about it. Aldridge asked me when I'd last checked on the status of that property. I told him I didn't know. He suggested I find out. What I found out required a trip to the county recorder's office, which is a thing I had not done in approximately 30 years. The woman at the counter was helpful. She pulled up the property record in about 90 seconds. The deed had been modified 7 months ago. My wife had filed a quitclaim deed. My name was no longer on it. I stood at that counter for a moment and read the document twice. Then I folded it carefully, thanked the woman, walked out to my truck, and sat in the parking lot for about 15 minutes. The quitclaim deed had been filed 7 months ago, 1 month after the insurance change. 9 months total before she handed me those divorce papers. My father had built that house. He'd bought the lot in 1971, poured the foundation himself with 2 friends, built it over the course of a year on weekends. He left it to me when he died. My name had been on that deed since 1997. Now it wasn't, and I had a tremor in my right hand from a stroke, and a wife who had filed for divorce, and a timeline that I was starting to understand in a way I did not particularly want to understand. I went back to Aldridge. He looked at the deed copy. He looked at the deed copy. He looked at me. "Was your signature on this?" he asked. I looked at the signature line. The signature there was mine. Shaky, like something written on a moving bus. Like my handwriting after the stroke. Except the deed had been filed 7 months ago, before my stroke. I have thought about that moment many times since. The way the room got very quiet, the way Aldridge set the document down on his desk and folded his hands, the way he said, carefully, "Mr. Darlow, I want you to think very carefully about whether you signed this document." I had not signed that document. I had not been to the county recorder's office. I had not signed a quitclaim deed on my father's house. My tremor began after my stroke, and my stroke was 9 months after this document was filed. The signature was someone's approximation of what a shaky version of my handwriting might look like. Someone had practiced. I sat in that chair and I breathed for a moment. Then I said, "What do I do?" Aldridge said, "First, you don't sign anything else. Not the divorce papers. Not anything she puts in front of you. Nothing." He paused. "Second, we call someone I know at the DA's office. I'm going to be honest about what the next few months were like because I think people expect this kind of story to be about triumph. And triumph is a complicated thing when it involves someone you spent 31 years with. There were forensic document examiners. There were depositions. My wife retained a second attorney when the first one figured out what she was facing. Her sister, who had been added to the insurance policy, was questioned. There were conversations with the DA's office that I sat through feeling like a stranger in my own life. My daughter came up from Knoxville again and stayed for 2 weeks. She didn't say much, which was the right instinct. She cooked dinner and took the dog on walks and occasionally sat next to me on the couch without saying anything, which is sometimes all you need from another person. My son was angry in the way practical men get angry. Focused, useful, forward-moving. He organized documents. He drove me to appointments. He spoke with Aldridge on the phone in the evenings in a low voice that I wasn't meant to hear but did, updating him on things I'd told him. My wife moved out in December. She went to her sister's house, which was where, it turned out, a great deal of planning had taken place. The forensic examiner's report confirmed what Aldridge and I had already concluded. The signature on the quitclaim deed was a forgery, produced with knowledge of what my handwriting looked like, in an attempt to simulate the tremor that my stroke had caused, a tremor that did not exist at the time the deed was supposedly signed. There are 2 ways to read that fact. One is that someone forged my signature 9 months before my stroke, using a tremor I didn't have yet, which would mean they knew a tremor was coming. The other is that the document was forged after my stroke, backdated, and filed using a notary who either didn't verify identity properly or was complicit. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about which of those possibilities the DA's office took more seriously. What I can tell you is that the investigation was thorough and it moved slowly the way these things do. And there were many days during those months when I sat with Prentice on his back porch and watched the birds work the feeder and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say. One morning he asked me, "How are you holding up?" I thought about it. "I feel stupid," I said. "I feel like I should have known." He shook his head. "You trusted someone. That's not the same as being stupid. Being stupid is not learning anything afterward." I thought about that a lot. The house my father built is mine again. That took about 8 months between the legal process and the court order and the corrected deed filed with the county recorder. I drove out to see it on the day everything was finalized. It was February, cold. The grass brown and flat, the big oak in the backyard bare. The tenants had moved out the previous fall and it had been sitting empty. I walked through it room by room. The bedroom my father had framed himself. The kitchen with the linoleum he'd laid in 1974, which I'd always meant to replace and somehow never had. The basement with the shelving he'd built along the east wall, still solid, the wood barely faded. I sat down on the back steps in my coat and looked at the yard. I thought about my father, who had poured the foundation himself and built this house with his hands and worked 30 years as a machinist to make sure I had something solid under me when he was gone. I thought about what it means to build something. The patience of it, the accumulation of small efforts, one on top of another, year after year, until there's something real and lasting. I thought about the fact that I was 63 years old, sitting on my father's back steps in February, and the life I'd thought I had was not the life I'd actually had, and I was going to have to figure out what came next. I was not as devastated as I'd expected to be. The divorce was finalized in March. It was nothing like the quick and tidy thing she'd apparently imagined when she filed, an efficient disposal of a man who was no longer useful, who'd had a stroke, whose hand shook, who was past his prime. It was a long process that involved discovery and depositions and a judge who was not impressed by the discrepancies in the timeline. I got the house. I got the rental property. I got the portion of our joint accounts that should have been mine. The insurance policy was returned to its original structure. She got what she'd brought to the marriage, which was considerably less than what she'd hoped to leave with. I'm not going to say I felt nothing watching it play out. 31 years is 31 years. There were things we built together that were real, not just property, not just accounts. There were 20 years that were genuinely good, or at least genuinely shared. There was a woman I thought I knew, but I also signed those divorce papers in March. Carefully, deliberately, with my right hand that shakes a little now, and always will. And I thought about that morning 6 months ago when she slid the manila envelope across the granite counter and said, "Don't make it dramatic." I didn't make it dramatic. I didn't make it dramatic. I just paid attention. It's May now. I started renting the house again. A young couple, teachers, who leave the oak tree alone and seem to genuinely like the linoleum in the kitchen. I have coffee with Prentice 3 mornings a week. My niece still complains in cold weather. My hand still shakes. My daughter calls on Sundays. My son drives up once a month and we work on things around the house. Nothing complicated, just maintenance, just the ordinary business of keeping something solid in good repair. I'm not looking for sympathy. I want to be clear about that. I'm 63 years old and I've still got the house my father built and my name is on the deed. And the coffee is hot in the morning and the birds are back at the feeder. What I want to say to anyone who's listening, especially if you're my age, especially if you've spent decades trusting someone else to handle the details, especially if you've had a bad year and you're moving slow and you think the hard part is behind you, pay attention to what's in your name. Not because everyone is planning something, most people aren't, but because you built something, you worked for something, and nobody is going to protect it for you. I learned that sitting on my father's back steps in February, wearing my coat, looking at a yard that was finally mine again. I should have learned it sooner, but I know it now. I've had a lot of time to think about how this all unfolded, not obsessively. I'm past that. But the way you think about something when it finally makes sense, when the pieces are just sitting there in the right order and you can see the whole picture without flinching. What happened to me wasn't random. And I don't mean that in some mystical way. I mean it practically, mechanically, the way a man who spent 40 years doing electrical work understands cause and effect. Every wire leads somewhere. Every connection either holds or it doesn't. What I lived through was the direct result of choices, hers and mine. Her choices were deliberate, calculated over months, maybe years. The insurance change. The deed. The attorney retained quietly. The filing done on a Tuesday when I was upstairs sleeping. None of that was impulsive. It required patience and planning and a belief that I wouldn't look closely enough to notice. That belief was for a long time correct. That's the part I sit with, not anger. I'm genuinely past anger, but a clear-eyed accounting of the fact that I made it easy. I handled the physical things and let someone else handle the paper things, and I told myself that was partnership, when really it was abdication. You can love someone and still be negligent about what you've built together. I was, but here's what I also know. The moment I started paying attention, things changed. Not because the universe rewarded me for it. Because attention is a practical tool. It finds things. Prentice told me to pay attention to what was in my name, and I did. And what I found gave Aldridge something to work with. And what Aldridge worked with gave the court something to rule on, and the court gave me back my father's house. That's not luck. That's a chain of actions producing predictable results. Cause and effect, same as always. The stroke humbled me. I won't pretend otherwise. There's something about your own body failing without warning that strips away a particular kind of arrogance. The arrogance of assuming you have time, assuming things will hold, assuming the people around you are who you believe them to be. I came home from that hospital moving slower, thinking more carefully, noticing things I'd been too busy or too comfortable to notice before. In some strange way, the stroke did me a service, not one I'd choose, but one I can acknowledge. What I want to say, and I mean this directly, not as a platitude, is that intelligence isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being willing to look at what's actually in front of you, even when looking is uncomfortable. I didn't want to find what I found in those financial documents. Part of me, even then, was hoping for an innocent explanation. But I kept looking. That willingness to know the truth, even when the truth is hard, is what made the difference. And the endurance part, the months of depositions and document examiners and court dates and the slow grind of a legal process that doesn't care how tired you are. My son drove me to appointments. My daughter sat next to me on the couch. Prentice poured coffee and didn't say anything unnecessary. You get through hard things one ordinary day at a time. That's all there is to it. I'm 63. I have a tremor in my right hand, a house my father built, and coffee in the morning, and enough sense now to read everything I sign. That's what I have. It's enough.